Really cool. All right, perfect. All right, so we have the infamous Matt Ward. Thank you so much for hopping on a quick call with me today. We are really, really excited for the live webinar that's scheduled in a couple weeks here, talking about imaging with diets and dysphagia in skilled nursing facilities. So I just wanted to give you a chance to kind of let us know what we can expect in that webinar, maybe some things that you're excited to talk about that maybe we didn't get touched on in that research article. So I'll let you kind of take it away.
Yeah, the probably the best way to start this is to talk about what the research question was that drove this. And to be sure, Ed Weiss and Chris Galick, who are the first two authors on this paper, were the ones who came up with the idea for this project. And then I ended up helping with collecting data and also some of the writing. But the anybody who's worked as a speech language pathologist outside of acute care is probably familiar with one of these unwritten rules there's lots of professions have unwritten rules. Um, One of the unwritten rules in speech therapy appears to be for clinicians who are outside of post or outside of acute care is if a patient is diagnosed with dysphagia in acute care, until we find out differently, their treatment plan is continued from acute care. So it's kind of assumed that they still have dysphagia and they still need those same recommendations. And so that was the first question is, in the overarching question for this project was, do those recommendations still match? And so we pulled records from 120 different SNF patients uh, to see if those folks still had dysphagia. So we used the digest fees, which is reliable and validated, to determine if they actually still had dysphagia. And then we also just looked, did the diet recommendations match? So if they were recommended NPO with alternate means in the hospital, were we still recommending that at the next level of care? We also looked at, if they were on, let's say, an IDSI 6 diet or an IDSI level 5 or whatever it was in acute care, are those still the same recommendations we're making now? So some of those endpoints is what we were looking at for those patients. And um, it turns out that there's a lot of data in this study. And so the nice thing about the webinar for me is that you're going to get to hear us expound upon some of the points, because it's interesting to me, having been part of research a few times now. I'm a new PhD, and so by no means an expert researcher, but um, it, it is when you have a solid research question that is very clear and you have a simple but thorough design of your research, you can find a whole lot there. And so if you read this article, there's a couple paragraphs where I don't know that it's confusing, but it'll say 30 of the 32 patients who were NPO and 67% of the 25 patients who were recommended this diet level. So it can kind of, it's not necessarily hard to read or anything like that, but there's a lot of numbers, and being able to pull what's clinically useful out of them can be challenging if you're
Right.
sitting down to read this. And so one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to end up expanding upon some of the ramifications of that. We will also talk a little bit about, what the research questions were, and how we arrived at those. And so hopefully what the webinar provides is something for clinicians who maybe don't love reading research, because it's not everyone's cup of tea to
Yeah.
read research articles. And sometimes it's hard. Like, you forget that, not everyone has had advanced biostatistics or something like that. And so knowing what a chi-square is or knowing what a goodness of fit model is not something that most of us got at the master's level. At least we
Yeah.
didn't become fluent at it at the master's level. And so going into those things and talking about them, I guess if we need something that is one of the major findings of this paper, that we will get into and talk a good bit about, is patients who are recommended to be NPO and have some sort of alternate means of nutrition and hydration in the hospital. When we saw those patients in the SNF, um, only 45% of those patients who are recommended to be NPO with alternate means um, were, yeah, only 45%. Sorry, that number just flew out of my head, but only 45% of those patients actually had an instrumental swallow assessment in the hospital.
Mm.
So there's a lot of bedsides and NPO, and I get there are barriers, I get there are
Yeah.
limitations, I get not every patient requires a modified barium swallow study or a FEES, or you just can't do it sometimes because of patient concerns or they discharge before you get a chance.
Yeah.
I understand all of those things. But the thing for me is I don't believe that number is a good number for us, meaning we're feeding tubes are a pretty significant intervention, and we need to know that those patients require them. And it's really hard to do that from a clinical swallow eval alone. Um, and I would argue sometimes it's not necessarily ethical to recommend that from a clinical swallow eval alone. If you
Yeah.
have the ability to do it and the patient does need it, and we're choosing not to do that, that puts us in an ethically gray area because I'm not sure how we fully inform our patients of what the risks of treatment versus non-treatment are if we're not really sure what's going on.
Yeah.
And the data has been out there for a long time on bedsides, and we're about 50% accurate at the bedside for most bedside evals. Now, I'm not talking about certain things like the uh, Toronto, the Torbest, or maybe something like the Yale, which they are clinically well researched. We're just talking about a classic clinical swallow eval that most of us were taught to kind of make up as we go
Yeah.
along,
Yeah.
because there is
Do
no
your
one
best.
standardized one, right? And so, uh, if we're just doing those by choice, it's hard for us to be accurate more than 50%. And it's a hard way to inform our patients of what they need. So those numbers were a little shocking for us. I knew that the number would be high, but I didn't know it would be that high, especially if we're recommending some sort of tube feeding. Or that's not that we recommend tube feedings as SLPs, but we're recommending non-oral nutrition of some
Yeah.
kind. And all of those non-oral nutrition options end up having some significant negative health risks associated with them. And so that number was a little shocking to me. The other number that was really shocking to me was that, let me see if I can find it because I just highlighted this. Uh, yeah, 67% of the patients receiving a modified diet or NPO in the hospital in acute care did not have dysphagia when we reassessed.
Mm. Mm.
So if we're thinking about the overarching sort of broad theme of this paper, and the initial research question is, are we able to continue utilizing recommendations from acute care? It looks like the data is telling us no. That's a pretty bad option
Mhm.
because I mean we're almost at 70% of those patients no longer having dysphagia, and the criteria we used for that is the digest fees score of 0 or 1 is not indicative of patients having dysphagia, and we will get more into that in the webinar. But
Sure.
yeah, almost 70% of our patients did not have dysphagia, even though they were flagged as having dysphagia in the hospital. And every single patient in this study was receiving speech therapy.
Mm. Mm.
So it's, not speech therapy that was probably not necessary for those folks.
Sure.
And so for us, it's those numbers, those are the numbers that sort of stick out to me.
Well, and those are the numbers that need to assist in shifting clinical practice so that it is best practice for patients. I have spoken with a few patients, and I used to work in skilled nursing facilities. And I had spoken with a few patients that felt stuck from their original diagnosis in acute care because of this very reason. They get diagnosed with something or they're recommended something, and then it stays with them forever.
Yes.
And it's our job. I can't imagine if we were to go into a primary care doctor and they get it right 50% of the time on a clinical eval. We would never go back to that doctor. And our patients are counting on us as the professional to provide them with the everything, the whole gamut, educate them. Are we recommending feeding tubes? No, but we can at least educate and give them as much information and as much knowledge so that they can also be part of that deciding factor. And if we're not giving them that opportunity, at the end of the day, we're doing a disservice to our patients.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about modified texture diets. There's been a lot of research, and it seems to be actually making its way into standard practice for people slowly but surely. That for a long time, I'm not sure that we knew that there were negative health risks associated with the use of modified texture diets, thickened liquids. Um, but the literature has borne that out, that there are actually lots of negative health risks that can be associated with their use. So we need to make sure that you need those thickened liquids, and no
Yeah.
one likes them. I say no one,
No.
that's not a fair statement. Very few patients tolerate altered
Mhm.
diets and thickened liquids. They
Mhm.
just will describe them as awful, as vile, as
Mhm.
disgusting, as baby food, they'll call it sometimes. Like, I'm sure you've heard all of those things.
Absolutely.
And so it is, because early on we thought as a profession stopping people from aspirating meant stopping pneumonia.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
almost cared about that endpoint more than
Mhm.
anything.
Yep.
Just, if let's thicken the liquids, let's change the solids, and let's stop them from aspirating, because that will help. I
Yeah.
always want to say this when I talk to SLPs. I know this comes from a good place. It didn't come from a place where we wanted to restrict diets,
Yeah.
or we wanted to
Yeah.
make people eat and drink things that were not necessarily great for them, or that they
Yeah.
didn't like.
Yeah.
But that is where we've ended up, as being sort of the diet police. And I
Yeah.
never wanted to do that. I'm not a big fan of standing between my patients and things they want. And it's also more intrusive than just about any other medical intervention you can think of. It is 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And if you've
It
ever
affects
had
everything.
yeah, I've had some dental issues in the past where I was on like a liquid diet for a while. At that point, you're not, living to eat, you're eating to live. And it takes all of the joy and fun out of eating. And eating and drinking should be fun. There's a whole social and psychological and
Yeah,
religious
absolutely.
component to food that is massive. Birthdays
Absolutely.
that you celebrate are around food. I'm thinking any religious holiday that doesn't
Absolutely.
involve some sort of food, like they don't exist. And so this is such
No.
a important part of us culturally. In fact, I was looking back at some Instagram photos I had posted of some of our work trips. And invariably, when we go to train people in different cities or different countries to do fees, my Instagram shows up with pictures of all the places I eat and like
Yeah,
all the food that I have.
exactly. Yeah.
And people will say, well, what'd you do while you were there? And like when you're working on a trip, it's hard to do a lot of things other than go to cool places to eat.
Yeah.
And so my Instagram is just full of like, this is what I ate here. This is what I ate in Vancouver. But it is one of those things that people want to hear about. And you like, oh, I had the best meal or the best sushi of my life last time I was in wherever. And it's that you're right about saying that it sticks with patients forever. If you have a diagnosis of aspiration pneumonia, especially, so let's just not just say dysphagia. Let's say you got the dreaded diagnosis
Yeah.
of aspiration pneumonia. Trying to get that off of your chart once you're better, which may be after 3 or 4 days, it's
Yeah.
cleared,
Yeah.
uh, it is nearly impossible. And it
Yeah.
scares the life out of most SLPs. And I also understand. My first job was working in SNFs I did that for the first 5 years of my career. And so it's harder. It was not impossible. It was harder for me to get swallow studies than it was for my acute care friends who were literally a mile down the road from me at the hospital. So they could do their modifieds whenever they needed them to, pretty much, on almost any patient they needed to. For me, I had to get sort of permission from my DOR and
Yeah.
permission from the
Jump through a
administrator,
lot of hoops.
because it's an extra expense that no one
Yeah.
wants to cover unless they have to. And so I understand why the sort of practice has been, the unwritten rule has been, let's continue those acute care recommendations until we can get a modified or a fees, because it's taken us a while. So
Yeah.
I understand that point of friction. But again, one thing this paper seems to have highlighted is the how significant a change it is in our patients just by transferring. So one of the things we didn't include in this is because we didn't collect the data, but I looked back at the patients that I pulled for this sample, and many of these patients had not been in a sniff for like months when we got the fees done. Some of them had been there for a couple days
Hmm.
because mobile fees companies can often get to you pretty quickly.
Right.
Like our turnaround time for the company I work for is 24, 48 hours
Yeah.
if you call us. So we can get there pretty quickly. And so if I was looking at the studies that I pulled for this, I think I did some quick math on my iPhone calculator. So this is not data we pulled for this, and this is not rigorous, but I just wanted to know because I figure someone's going to ask this question. I think it was like 5.6 days after getting to the sniff was when we were assessing them. So it's not like we were 3 months down the road
Sure.
and they were healed. It seems to be, and I've talked with Ed and Chris about this too. It really seems that just the ability to be stable enough to transfer. And I know they're getting sicker and sicker, sent out sicker and sicker all the time, but just the ability to transfer seems to be enough to significantly change someone's dysphagia,
Wow. That's a
whether it's
great
the
point.
severity of their dysphagia or
Mhm.
whether they still have it or not. So
Yeah.
some still had it, and I don't want to run over those numbers because
Sure.
yes, some patients still had it. Yes, some patients still were recommended alternative means of nutrition and hydration. Yes, some were still recommended all their diets, but it was a much smaller percentage than we would have thought. And
Yeah.
this paper should or could help clinicians argue for instrumental assessments
Yeah.
if they need them. I had to argue for them in my facilities because it was an extra cost, and this data would have helped me out a lot.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, I think this opportunity in general, just getting to engage in conversation and hear directly from researchers is few and far between. So I will say from I'm not actively in clinical work, but as an SLP, it does mean a lot that you guys will take the time to just talk about the research and talk about your findings and what that means. And having you guys, I mean, you're on the ground, so just the clinical work that you're doing and how much you guys are involved in it day to day, it means a lot. And I think that if we can take these opportunities and use it to impact the betterment of patient care, it's always worth it. So we're really excited about it.
Yeah, we are too. I tell clinicians this all the time. I don't know what I thought about researchers before now, but you know, when I was a clinician practicing in the SNFs, I remember, if you read research or you read articles, I remember reading the Yale Swallow Protocol, the book that Deborah Suter and Steve Leader published on the Yale Swallow Protocol, and you kind of build up this idea of in your head of these people that they are so much smarter than everyone else in the
Yeah,
world, and that
yeah,
they might not want to take time to talk to you, or they might be so busy. Researchers generally, and I want to say this to clinicians all the time, researchers generally asking them about the research is like asking someone to show you pictures of their kids or their dog.
yeah, yeah.
They're almost never going to feel inconvenienced, and you're almost always going to
Yeah,
hear more than you maybe wanted to,
yeah.
because there's all
Great
sorts of
point.
things like the reasons you did the research that may not make it into the paper, or interesting things you found that weren't maybe germane to your original research question, but you can talk about.
Sure.
And researchers tend to like to talk about that. So I always want to say to clinicians, there is an email of the first author on everything that's ever published. And if you can't get a copy, if like the article you want to read is behind a paywall, you can email those researchers and they have the
Yeah,
ability to send you, they can't mass distribute copies, but they can send you a personal copy of the research. And if you ever see somebody at a conference, like somebody you've read a lot of their articles, generally speaking, they're nice and
yeah,
approachable and would not mind that. And just hearing those researchers talk about why they did it, what they did, I mean, what it means is often sometimes so very illuminating. And I know I was scared to talk to those researchers when I was first out, and I'd see them at conferences or something, and oh, I don't want to bug them, or oh, I don't want to go up after their presentation and ask them something. And I will say, unless they're hungry after their presentation or exhausted after their presentation, they're probably going to be happy to talk to you.
Fair, yeah.
So feel free to ask questions. We're happy to. I think we had this original meeting with Christoph where he said, do you guys want to talk about this? And how are we gonna structure this? And we're like, yeah. And he's like, well, how do you need to be compensated for this? And we were like, we don't really, we just kind of
You're like,
want
we
to
just want
talk
to
about
talk about
this.
it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love
Yeah,
that.
we like talking about it. We want to talk about it, and we want it out there because I do feel like this research could be beneficial. I mean, I feel like it would have been beneficial for me and could be very beneficial to other clinicians if you can just get it in front of them somehow.
Yeah.
So any way we can do that, we're happy to do.
Yeah. Well, the team at PATCOM is very, very grateful for you. I won't take up too much more of your time, but we're really looking forward to it. I'm excited to share this to get other people excited about it. Anything else that you want to touch base on before we're finished up?
Not
Don't want to
that,
give don't want to give too many, insider
right.
snippets.
We'll
So
we'll just tease it, we'll
yes,
just give
yeah,
you a couple little snippets, and then we'll get into it in the webinar.
yeah,
But no, that those, I think the stuff that I already talked about were the biggest things I wanted to highlight in this conversation. And then anything you wanted to talk about, I was fine to talk about too. So
yeah. Well, I appreciate it. This has been perfect. I'm gonna go ahead and stop recording.